And joining us now is Daphne Wysham, who's a Climate Justice Program Director at the Center for Sustainable Economy and the Director of the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, where she works with sustainable businesses, community groups, public health officials, and labor leaders in the Pacific Northwest on reversing the climate impact of deforestation and in transforming the region from a major fossil fuel export economy into a leading clean energy economy. Welcome to Background Briefing, Daphne Wysham.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, thank you, Daphne. And I'm sorry that you had to evacuate, but a lot of the state of Oregon, you live in Portland or near Portland, and the state is on fire, along with California and Washington.
Yeah, it's really unprecedented fires.
And the president, of course, flew into Sacramento today, met with Governor Newsom. They're quite the opposite, in terms of Newsom wanting to deal with climate change and Trump being a climate denier.
Yep.
Do you expect anything to come from the Trump visit?
I don't. I don't expect anything to come from the Trump visit. I'm delighted to see that Biden has actually made a very powerful speech today on climate change, one of his best yet. So, I'm absolutely certain that Trump won't be connecting the dots between the climate crisis and the record temperatures and the drought and the fires that are now sweeping the entire West Coast. But I suppose the choice couldn't be clearer for those of us who believe in the science.
Well, Biden today said, if you give a climate arsonist 4 more years in the White House, why would anyone be surprised if we have more of America ablaze? Interestingly enough, or sadly enough, when the other day when Trump was doing a press conference at which he admitted that he spent an entire day watching Fox News, 8 hours. He listed all of the TV shows, from the morning shows to Tucker Carlson and company at night. And this was the very day that your governor there in Oregon was calling the White House desperate for help because her state was ablaze, and she couldn't get Trump on the phone because he was watching Fox all day.
Yeah, the connection between reality and this man's thinking seems to be mediated exclusively through Fox News. So it's not surprising that we're getting a very distorted view of reality from our president. But, everything from his sense of what's appropriate to speak to a journalist about. I mean, Bob Woodward's latest book shows that he's so unself-aware that he's disclosing things like, the fact that he waited to urge any sort of swift action on the COVID crisis, even though he clearly knew that it was a very deadly, much more deadly than the flu. And he's talking very openly about how he gets along well with people that are sort of dictatorial in nature. And this is the man that is representing our country. It's shameful.
But you have a real problem there in Portland and in Oregon. And one of the things that I find extraordinary about the news coverage that we're hearing is that these peculiar people from the QAnon group are calling up local officials, police, etc., and talking about Antifa setting fires, and they're sending armed groups out into the country looking for Antifa arsonists. And then apparently the police are also getting false calls or crank calls from these QAnon people saying that there's looting going on, when in fact people are driving with their cars full of their personal possessions because they're fleeing the fire. And this again overburdens the police. So tell us about what's going on in your state.
Well, what's going on in our state is a microcosm of what's happening elsewhere. And I have seen on the Nextdoor apps and other things, you see these rumors spreading like wildfire. And I think part of it is a symptom of a society that's lost one of its most fundamental democratic institutions, namely good local journalism and good news media. And so people are spreading rumors on apps like this, listening to Fox News, picking up on conspiracy theories. And it's all being sort of reaffirmed in this vacuum of accurate information coming from accurate, reliable sources. So, yes, we did have this rumor that was flying around that Antifa was somehow, the boogeyman. And of course, that's been played up by Trump in the White House, claiming that Antifa is, this evil source of, hazards, and that's why they needed to bring in the federal troops to Portland and the Black Lives Matter protests. He stirred up these conspiracy theories, and unfortunately, people are believing our president, especially if they're getting their information from Fox News and no other source. It's not surprising to me in the least that they would latch on to these conspiracy theories.
Well, it's not just the QAnon types, though, that are spreading these weird theories that Trump gets from people like Alex Jones. I just talked to a friend who said he has a friend who's a lawyer, a very educated guy, and this lawyer told him that Bob Woodward had retracted everything in his recent book, and that's apparently out there in the Fox right-wing ecosystem. So, again, I'm speaking with Daphne Wysham, who's the Climate Justice Program Director at the Center for Sustainable Economy and the Director of the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, where she works with sustainable businesses, community groups, public health officials, and labor leaders in the Pacific Northwest on reversing the climate impacts of deforestation and in transforming the region from a major fossil fuel export economy into a leading clean energy economy. So let's talk a little bit about what you expect these fires, the impact that you expect these fires to have politically. Obviously, they're not going to have much of an impact on Trump, and on the plane flying into the Air Force One flying into Sacramento today, he told the reporters it's all about forest management, and went on with this bizarre idea that he has that you're supposed to rake the forest of all of the leaves and debris and the kindling, just as you rake autumn leaves off your lawn. And can you imagine how labor intensive that would be? So that's his idea, and he's even said that he might hold back funds for states who don't adopt this ridiculous idea of his. So that's what you're dealing with there. Now, maybe this nightmare will be over in November, but how do you see this in terms of the broader public getting the message about the reality of climate change? They must notice something's going on.
Yeah. I'm just speaking as an Oregonian in the state where big timber is like king coal is in West Virginia. The timber industry has a lock on reality as well here in the state. They've promulgated their own studies, perpetuate this myth that we just need more clear cuts, we need more thinning of forests in order to prevent forest fires, we need more tree plantations, when the exact opposite is true. Tree plantations, such like the ones that are now going up in flames around the state, they're what we call bomb forests. They go up rapidly in flames because they're all uniform in size. They're densely packed in like matchsticks, and they dry out the soil. You don't have this wonderful, abundant undergrowth and biological diversity and spongy soil that you would see in forests that are allowed to mature naturally with different successional stages of different plants and other species. They are the first to go up in flames. And this is what the timber industry is already ready with their propaganda that they're getting out in the Washington Post and in the New York Times and elsewhere, in the Oregonian, claiming that the reason for the fires is because of the elites in Portland who want to turn Oregon's forests into a playground for them, and that they don't care about people out in rural communities, when nothing could be further from the truth. Most of the forest land in Oregon is owned by Wall Street corporations, some of them foreign corporations, who are liquidating this asset with no regard for jobs, with no regard for environmental sustainability, with no regard for how quickly they'll go up in flames. one of the places that was burning the longest was this mill where they had stacked just an extraordinary number of raw logs waiting to be exported probably to China. And you see this over and over again in these rural towns, just stacked 100, 200 feet tall of nothing but raw logs. And the jobs have been disappearing in these rural communities because everything is mechanized. So we have polarized our state to such a degree that it's the urban-rural divide on this. There's very little dialogue going on, and a lot of the money that is flowing into the coffers of politicians, whether they're Democrat or Republican, is coming from the same source, namely big timber, the Koch brothers, the extractive economy. So we're up against a very challenging situation in a part of the world where our forests have the potential to store more carbon than any other place on the planet, even the Amazon. In particular, the forests that are on the coastal region of Oregon, Washington, and up into British Columbia it's some of the densest carbon-rich soil if left alone, and it also is fire-resistant if left alone in the same way that some of the old redwood forests are fire-resistant because there's a lot more moisture in the natural soils. So we are creating a habitat here in the Pacific Northwest that is the exact opposite of what we need to be doing, a habitat that is very fire-prone. My partner actually works on forest issues, and he is deeply concerned that there is no more spotted owl habitat, that it's all gone up in flames. For decades we've been trying to defend this, but it keeps getting encroached upon, and there's just tiny little pockets here and there. So we're losing irreplaceable species, and we've lost the jobs already. And then they want to build pipelines through this terrain in the southern part of Oregon and in the communities around Medford. Some of the nonprofit groups down there have seen their offices completely vaporized in the fires down there, and they're fighting this pipeline that is being proposed. It's a top priority for the Trump administration. It's a Pembina corporation. It's a Canadian corporation that wants to bring gas via pipeline for export from Coos Bay. Can you imagine a worse possible location than in an earthquake subduction zone in a fire-prone region like Southern Oregon, which is, recently just had this devastating fires, to be proposing to build a 250-mile gas pipeline through that terrain? It's just madness. But, the fight will continue, and people are now in sort of a mutual aid moment where people are trying to find out what people need. Of course, masks are in great need right now in that part of the state because of the pandemic and also because of the smoke. A lot of people have lost their homes. It's truly tragic what's happened.
And how does this situation relate to the ongoing battle in Portland that has gotten the country's attention? Obviously a distorted version that Donald Trump and Fox News are putting out, but nevertheless, still, it is kind of in the crosshairs of our divided country, is it not?
Well, the unique thing about Oregon and Portland in particular is that we have a very racist history, that a lot of people who, move to Portland thinking it's a wonderful progressive enclave don't understand that the state was actually constructed and established with a ban on Black people as soon as they were free. There's still written into some of the property, the real estate holdings, certain people of color cannot be out after a certain time of day. Of course, do they enforce that? No, not necessarily legally, but they do it in sort of a wink and a nod way in different parts of the Portland metropolitan area. And that's where things are actually relatively safe for people of color. Out in rural communities, it's very rare that you'll see people of color in the sort of diversity that you will see in the Portland region. And even there, it's, I would say, maybe 10% of the population is people of color. So we have a racist history. We have a racist police force. The police have been absolutely brutal with the protesters. And one of our law clerks this past summer was a legal observer at the Black Lives Matter protests, and she routinely saw the police misusing and abusing not just their batons, but firing off tear gas canisters just indiscriminately for no reason, deliberately targeting Black youths. She said in one instance, and I encouraged her, and she did get the article published, she saw police officers as the protests were winding down and these two Black youths were heading home. They just tossed these tear gas canisters out the window at them as they drove by. In the middle of a pandemic, this is just insanity, and it's a clear abuse of power. So there's a lot of rage that has been bottled up for decades that's now being played out. And that's not to say there aren't people that are showing up with other goals and other agenda items, but right across the river in Vancouver, you have the so-called Proud Boys and the white supremacists who love to come across and goad the Antifa and the other protesters in fights. And unfortunately, that's resulted in one person being killed and another being hunted down by the police and being killed up in Washington state. So it's a complicated situation. The white supremacy in the police force is something that the FBI have been warning about for quite some time. And I would say in the Pacific Northwest, it's taken root, not just in Portland, but in other communities as well outside of the Portland area.
Well, Daphne Wysham, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Daphne Wysham, who's a Climate Justice Program Director at the Center for Sustainable Economy and the Director of the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, where she works with sustainable businesses, community groups, public health officials, and labor leaders in the Pacific Northwest on reversing the climate impacts of deforestation and in transforming the region from a major fossil fuel export economy into a leading clean energy economy. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with a professor of forest ecosystems and society at Oregon State University, where she researches landscape ecology, biogeography, pyrogeography, and conservation science.